Benvenuti ragazzi in questo nuovo episodio di Performance Talks. Oggi sfortunatamente ci sarò solo io, Riccardo non è potuto essere con noi. Oggi siamo contenti di ospitare Michael Boyle, che è una forse delle persone più influenti per quanto riguarda il mondo dello strength and conditioning. So welcome and thank you very much, Mike, for being with us today. May I call you Mike?
Absolutely. Call me anything you want.
Okay, perfect. So first of all, just thank you very much for being with us today, with me, I guess, today. And we can start with the podcast. So my first question is in regards about yourself. So could you give our listener a little bit of introduction about yourself, a little presentation of yourself?
So I am almost 62 years old. I'll be 62 in about a month. I've been doing this for a little bit over 40 years. I think I actually started coaching at the college level when I was either 21 or 22. I was pretty much right out of college. So I've been coaching for 40 years. I've coached at Boston University for about 30 years or parts of 30 years. I opened my own business, Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning, in 1997. So that was about 25 years ago. I worked for the Boston Bruins, which is the National Hockey League team in Boston, while I was working at Boston University, because then people were using part-time strength and conditioning coaches at the professional level. So I did that for most of the 90s, I think 91 to 99. 2012 and 13, I worked for the Boston Red Sox in Major League Baseball, and we won a World Series in 2013. And in between, I've sprinkled in just about every sport that you can imagine. If you can probably name it, we've probably had at least one really good high-level competitor at that particular sport. So,
well, it's not bad, not bad at all, may I say. Perfect. Moving on. So let's start with the real question. So you are kind of famous. No, let's say you are famous about the courses that you do. So the functional strength conditioning certificate, is it correct?
Certified functional strength coaches, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So my question is, what does it mean actually, functional training to you?
Well, functional training, it's a very interesting story, and I've told this story probably a lot of times, but not to an Italian audience, in the sense that we basically started looking at what people were doing in rehabilitation and the things that they were doing, core training, unilateral training, all of these things that were being done to bring back some of the high-level athletes that we were dealing with to competitive level. And that started to introduce us to this idea of functional anatomy, and the idea that maybe a lot of the anatomy that we had been taught in school wasn't exactly right. I think we are taught a very simplistic version of anatomy, what I would consider dead person anatomy, meaning what the muscles do in a lot of the books are not really what they do when you get somebody up on their feet and start working. We were taught that, quadriceps extend the knee, and that leg extensions are good for your quads, and that, your hamstrings flex your knee, and that leg curls are good for your hamstrings. But when you start to understand functional anatomy, you realize that it doesn't work that way at all. There are no knee extensors, there are no knee flexors, there are no plantar flexors. There are only muscles basically that resist the force of gravity. So if I put my foot on the ground, every muscle does the same thing. It prevents me from collapsing to the ground. They all eccentrically lengthen to stop my movement. When I push off the ground, all those muscles concentrically shorten. So the reality is that every muscle, as in this instance, in my lower extremity, is both a decelerator of flexion and an initiator of extension. And they're working all simultaneously at my ankle, my knee, and my hip. When you start to understand that, you start to look at training differently, and you start to think, maybe a lot of what people have told us isn't very true. Then you start looking at the core and at the pelvis and realize that when I have one foot on the ground, the muscles in my pelvis are doing something very different than when I have 2 feet on the ground. I put one foot on the ground, and suddenly my quadratus lumborum on one side needs to act to keep my pelvis level. My glute medius on the other side is helping to act to keep my pelvis level. My adductor is helping to keep my pelvis level. And you start to realize, wow, there's a lot of muscles that are working here in single leg stance, unilateral stance, that aren't really working in bilateral stance. And So the idea that we kind of came to was, wow, this bilateral stuff doesn't really make a lot of sense. So when I wrote Functional Training for Sports, the interesting thing about Functional Training for Sports, and this is you'll see I'm really good at long answers to short questions, but when Human Kinetics publishers came to me and said, we would like you to write a book on functional training. This was probably about 2002, maybe. And I said, I don't really know what functional training is. I don't think I'm the guy to write the book. And the then acquisitions editor said, well, we think what you're doing right now, the things that you're talking about and writing about, we think that's functional training. So I said, all right, so I can write a book about how we're training right now. And you're going to title it Functional Training for Sports and publish it. And they said, yes, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to write a book about what you're doing right now from a training standpoint. We're going to call it Functional Training for Sports, and we're going to sell it. So I kind of came around, to being a functional training guy kind of from the back door, in terms of I was just trying to do the best things that I could do, the things that made the most sense. So when I started writing the introduction to functional training, one of the things I said is that functional training is training that makes sense. So if I look at you and think, okay, you're training for soccer, your football or soccer. All right, I'm looking at this and thinking, does anybody kick the ball with two legs? No, definitely not. Does anybody run on both legs at the same time? Nope, that definitely doesn't happen either. So I started thinking to myself, wait, this doesn't really, the way that we do things conventionally doesn't make sense. And now think about, if you're thinking Europe at that time, machines, do you ever sit down on a chair and play soccer? No. Do you ever lie down on your back and play soccer? And you're like, no. Okay, well, why are we doing all these silly machine-based things? None of it made sense. So I think when we talk about what functional training is, it's simply things that make sense based on, and this is what I said, the relationship of the science of functional anatomy to what we know about training. We bring those two things together, and suddenly we've got unilateral training and core training and all these things that people would call functional training. But to me, it's just looking at how is the body working at any particular point in time and trying to make that be something sensible from a training standpoint.
Perfect. So basically, you answer even the question that I have to ask you later. So basically, yeah, moving on about this topic. My third question is in regards of precisely the difference between bilateral and unilateral work. And my question is, there is a lot of scientific evidence that supports the need to do more unilateral in regards of what, let's say, a sport performance, but also like the bilateral exercises tend to have way more transfer over to, let's say, power production, strength development, and everything, etc. So what would you change your approach in regards of unilateral and bilateral work? So
well, I don't think that bilateral training does have more carryover. And I don't think there's any research to prove that it does. The difference is, in this, I had this argument with another guy on a podcast, and he gave me all these examples. Look at all these studies that squatting improved this, and squatting improved this, and squatting improved this. And I said, no. Lower body strength, as demonstrated or trained by squatting, improved all of those quantities. You can't credit the bilateral training for the change. You can only credit training for the change. So much of what we would call evidence for bilateral training isn't evidence because it was never compared to unilateral training. So what people do, and this is why I think people who want to defend bilateral training cherry pick their research and say, look at this study. This showed that squat made your vertical jump go up. And I said, yeah, but did they compare it to any sort of good unilateral protocol to see if your vertical jump also went up? We've seen it and we've been doing it. The good thing for us, I always say, I don't need research. I don't need science because I train people every day and I look at results and I look at cause and effect. And we know for certain that what we're doing is working because we're seeing the speed increases. We're seeing the vertical jump increases. We're seeing all these things happen. And now there has been, in the last, say, 5 years, there's been a smattering of research studies comparing unilateral and bilateral. And if they don't show that bilateral is or unilateral is better. They always show that it's at least equal to. So, and I could point you to 5 or 6 fairly recent studies, you know, clearly in the like 2010 to 2020 period that have said this. So I think what ends up happening is the bilateral people are defending their turf now. The bilateral people are thinking people like me are going to make them obsolete, much in the same way that machine people have pretty much accepted the fact, okay, free weights are better than machines. But for a long time, the machine people really vigorously defended machine training and said, no, you know, that it was safer. They kept trying to find reasons why that people like me who were forsaking machines were wrong. And the same thing is happening now with bilateral training. The bilateral people are trying to find reasons why people like me that are forsaking bilateral training are wrong. But there really isn't good evidence to say that we are.
But as you said, like, so there might be equal. It's just like the actual training preference to decide whichever kind of training, if it's unilateral.
Well, but that's the difference. They might be equal. But if you look at injury rates, they're clearly not equal. Unilateral training is going to be significantly safer than bilateral training. The reason we got into unilateral training was primarily a safety issue. I did not get into unilateral training as much from a performance issue. The performance part was something that we kind of stumbled on a little more accidentally. What we were really looking for, particularly, we were looking for a decrease in back pain from squatting. So when we looked at like conventional back squatting, our, you know, quote unquote research showed us that about 20% of our athletes were actively dealing with back pain from squatting. And to me, that's too high a number. When you start thinking about the fact that in a university setting, we might have 600 athletes, which that would mean we'd have 120 athletes with back pain. That's a lot of athletes with back pain. And then the bilateral people say, well, that's, you don't teach squatting well enough. Your athletes aren't good enough at squatting. And what we were finding was we had people who were great at squatting, perfect at squatting, yet they were still experiencing episodic back pain. When we went to unilateral training, primarily, our back pain for us now is almost non-existent. And injuries for us are almost non-existent. It's rare that people get hurt at all. It's rare. We don't see the kind of groin injuries that people see in sport. We don't see the hamstring injuries. We're not seeing any of the things that are plaguing other people's athletes, plaguing ours. So again, I think for us, you know, and people would say it's all anecdotal evidence. And I would say when I started doing this, it was all anecdotal evidence. It was all opinion. It was, this is what I think and this is what I'm going to do. But the evidence has continued to mount on the unilateral functional training side. And I think 10 years from now, it won't even be a discussion anymore. But the difference is we'll be 30 years ahead 10 years from now, which is great for us.
Well, may I say I'm a bilateral guy, so but I write your book and I follow you for a while because you're such, you know, S&C, like well established in all around the world. I'm not completely sure about this last part of, like, let's say that unilateral work will just completely make obsolete the bilateral. In regard of this topic, I got another question. Would you change your approach on the change of the sports? Let's say, for example, if you have to deal with, I don't know, a shot putter or whatever, or maybe let's say a more power athlete, would you still believe that unilateral work would fit way more than bilateral for this kind of athlete?
Absolutely. We do it for everybody, irregardless of the sport. The only people I wouldn't do it for, powerlifters and Olympic lifters, people who have to compete bilaterally, and maybe rowers. I think rowers are unique in the sense that they compete bilaterally. Everybody else competes unilaterally. So to me, again, when we go back to this idea of functional training is training that makes sense, it just makes sense to me that we would strengthen them unilaterally. The one exception for us, we do trap our deadlift with everybody who's healthy. That is our bilateral. We do Olympic lift because I don't look at Olympic lifting as strength. I look at Olympic lifting as power, and I'm a big hang clean fan. I like hang cleans. I like hang snatches. So we're not, I would say, 100% exclusively unilateral, but I would say from a squatting standpoint, we are 100% exclusively unilateral. And the thing that people look at, like I said, when you say like you're a bilateral guy, you should watch Alex Natera, who's a Australian rules football strength coach in Australia, obviously, but did a really good presentation for us on unilateral training. And they did a great, it wasn't really a research study. It was more a poster presentation one year. And I think it was the, either the Australian Strength and Conditioning Association or the UK Strength and Conditioning Association on unilateral training. And they did force plate stuff. And they showed that somebody who can body weight squat, so if I can do a one leg squat, stand in a box, do a one leg squat, that's equivalent to me squatting my body weight in external load. So if I weigh 100 kilos, if I can do a body weight squat, that's equivalent to a 100 kilo back squat. If I can do a body weight squat with 50% of my body weight, or one leg squat, 50% of my body weight, it's going to be equivalent to a double body weight back squat load. Because what Natera did, and this is what's really cool and why more people, I think, need to get out of their comfort zone and read things that they don't agree with. Natera went out and looked at this and said, okay, how do we actually calculate? Because one of the things that people would argue is, if you do a one leg squat, how much weight do you actually use? Natera's study went out and established, at least within reasonable parameters, how much weight somebody was using. And what he did, which is brilliant, there's a book called Range that David Epstein wrote, who also, I think, wrote, I forget, we wrote one of the talent books. I forget what his first one was. But Range, Epstein talks about the idea of what he calls undiscovered connections. And in undiscovered connections, it shows that something from a field totally unrelated to you comes in and helps you in your field. So Natera is trying to figure out basically what does the body weigh kind of from the waist up. So if someone's doing a one leg squat, how much weight are they using? And he found a study on pilots from 1955 that looked at the weight in the seat, because they were trying to figure out how much weight was actually in the seat of the plane. And so they did all these calculations. I guess they probably had people sitting on scales. I don't know how they really did it, but they somehow calculated it. And they came up with the idea that 68% of your body weight is your torso, arms, head. So correspondingly, 32% of your body weight is your lower limbs. So if I do a one leg squat, I have automatically done 84% of my body weight, because I've got 68% for my torso, 16% for one leg. So I've already got 84% of body weight as soon as I step on one leg, which I don't have when I get on two legs. And then when I start adding external load to that, so he does the example of a guy, say, a 100-kilo guy squatting 100 kilos, he squats 168 kilos because he's squatting the weight of his torso plus the weight on the bar. So 168 kilos means on each leg he has 84. I step on a box to do a one-leg squat, 84 kilos. So I don't have any external load. And one of the things that we talk about, like with the bilateral people, is that every lift that you do has what I would classify as an orthopedic cost.
Yep.
Which means it stresses joints. When I'm trying to train my legs, particularly via back squatting, I'm applying a large orthopedic load to my spine, because my spine has to be the transfer vehicle for the load to get to my legs. If I look at that and say, I can take all that spinal stress away, why would I not do it? What would stop somebody from doing it? And what stops somebody from doing it is the conventional mentality, all of the things that we've been told our whole life about how great squatting is, how important squatting is, what I've got to do, with squatting. But a lot of it to me is just people not really looking at the evidence, the research. As I said, they cherry pick. There's a lot of confirmation bias in the bilateral world in terms of, I want to believe this is true, and I'm going to search for evidence that it is. And people could look at me the same way and say, well, you're doing the same thing. You're searching for evidence that unilateral is better. And I would say, yes, I absolutely am, because there's a very large percentage of the world that doesn't agree with me. And we're more like, we're in the minority, but it's a minority that's increasing all the time. And then you think, like, again, and if you think in Europe, think about soccer, like I said, your football. I don't know I've never met a soccer player who wanted to back squat. Never.
Yes, sir. But this is like this is a different topic because you have to think about even the culture within the football. Let's say, for example, here in England.
Exactly. They don't even want to. They don't even want to lift weight.
Precisely, but that doesn't mean that they don't. I don't think they didn't even want to do one leg squat, for example. Like honestly, but that's another story because that's just
right.
Like it's a cultural thing and it's quite kind of different. But one thing that I would like to ask, if an athlete come to you and he's quite quite used to back squat or whatever, front squat, but you do front squat too, so
not very much, very rare now these days.
But if an athlete comes to you and he says like, this is my let's say my lower body lift and I'm confident with it, would you make the athlete change his opinion, or you just go with it?
Make him change his opinion. I always say to people, if you come to me and tell me how you want to train, you're in the wrong place. Why come to me? So I look at those people and think, whatever your activity is that you're trying to get ready for, I'm not going to tell you how to do that. So I would look at that from a training standpoint, and someone coming to me and say, I really like to do this, I would say, that's great. You should go do it somewhere else, but you won't do it here because we're not going to compromise what we believe in, particularly as it relates to athlete safety, in order to make an athlete happy. Like I look at it and think, I'm not in the business of making people happy. I'm in the business of making people better. And generally when they're better, they're happy. And generally when their back doesn't hurt, they're happy. We've had the very small minority of people who initially are a little put off by the fact that we won't let them do certain things. But that goes away really quickly when they see how much thought process underlies everything that we're doing. Most people are very quick to perceive us as experts, but we have a huge track record to rely on. So it's easy for us. That would not be as easy, for someone who is not in my position. But for someone who is in my position, we can kind of say, hey, people know, they know how we train. They know what we're about. If you're coming here, then you should expect ABC. And if you go there, you should expect to not be able to ask for D, because nope, that one's not on the list.
Okay, gotcha. Just forgive us, our listener, some numbers. So you do a lot of rear foot elevated split squat, right? That's kind of like
yeah, and we've actually gotten away from that in the last year, to be honest. Okay. So that's not as big a lift for us. We've become more sort of pure one leg squat oriented than rear foot elevated split squat. But keep going. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's just because I don't want to say like something negative, not negative, but wrong, because it's like the guy on the book. So basically, that's
right.
Why is everybody can relate to it. So give us, our listeners, some kind of number. How much load you put on your athletes on what leg squat, just to give us like a little bit ideas.
All right, let me think. I got to think in.
But even in pound, I'll do the.
Yeah, so 40 kilos or so, about 50% of body weight. So okay, that's what we're pushing for. We're pushing because if we get to 50% of body weight, then we're at that sort of mythical double body weight squat. And most of the bilateral people would tell you that double body weight squat is good, is enough. So for us to get to 50% of body weight puts us in that same category as you look at Alex and Tara's research.
Yeah. One other thing that I would like to say is that with this number in mind, you can, like, sometimes your way of thinking, like your vision, is kind of misunderstood and misinterpreted, because you see like people doing split squat with, like, I don't know, but like professional athletes doing here in Italy are doing split squat with like 2 dumbbells of kgs each, and it's like,
yeah, that's
make no sense. That's one thing.
Pretty close. Yeah, it's pretty close to useless, and that's why
okay,
people misunderstand the idea of functional training. Because functional training doesn't mean don't lift weights. It doesn't mean don't lift heavy. It doesn't mean don't get strong. It means respect anatomy and respect even neurology. I think, in all honesty, if there's there's a small amount of evidence that is going to increase over the years that will show you that I think bilateral training is bad for you athletically. I think as you get really good at bilateral training, you become less athletic. And I think powerlifters are extremely illustrative of that. Powerlifters as a group, and I'm a former powerlifter, so I feel like I can get away with saying it, they're not a very athletic crowd. You don't look at them and think, wow, there's a lot of other things that they could do. You look at them and think, they're pretty good at lifting weights bilaterally. But if bilateral training was as beneficial as everybody says it is, why aren't those people winning Olympic gold medals? Why aren't those people winning the high jump? Why aren't they winning the long jump? Why aren't they winning the sprints? Because everybody says like bilateral is the key. Like bilateral training, you get stronger, everything gets better. And I look and think, well, why are the strongest people in the world, the mountain, the guy from from Game of Thrones, right? He was like a level 3 basketball player in Iceland or something like that. He was, again, not a bad athlete, but average, right? I mean, why didn't he go to the NBA when he got on steroids and got really big and got really strong and became one of the strongest men in the world? You'd think he should be able to take that basketball skill and translate it directly into the basketball court and be dominant in the NBA. Yet you look and think he's probably worse at basketball after becoming one of the strongest men in the world. So I think there's a huge body of anecdotal evidence that people just don't want to look at because it doesn't fit their narrative. It doesn't fit their idea of how training is supposed to be. And that's the difference for me. I started out that way. I started out, typical dumb meathead powerlifter. But over time, being around all these really good athletes, I started looking at things very, very differently. And I started meeting people smarter than me and actually listening. And what happens with the bilateral people is they meet people smarter than them. And you know what they do? They argue with them. They argue to defend their point. They argue and say, no, this is the way it's supposed to be. And I think it's like I always say to people, the classic example, I've heard people say over and over again that stuff about Stuart McGill. Well, I don't agree with Stuart McGill. All he's ever done is study pig spines, blah, blah, blah. And I kind of look at people and think, how can you, in good conscience, disagree with someone who's arguably made a more contribution to the idea of core training and low back pain and all these things than anybody maybe in the history of the world? And yet we'll get like some meathead who'll say, oh, I don't agree with them. And I look and think, if you don't agree with them, you haven't listened to them. That tells me you haven't sat there and listened, because it's really hard to not agree with a guy who's spent, somebody like me, he spent 40 years studying the spine and back pain. And so when he says, I think this is a good idea, I think this is a bad idea, you got to kind of look at that and say, I got to think about that. And I've done that in every field, whether it was knees, shoulders, backs, track and field, whatever it was. I've always gone and found the experts and listened and tried to not argue, tried to sit there and think, okay, what can this person tell me that helps me to better prepare my athlete, or even now our adult clients? What helps me to make somebody feel better, move better? And that ends up being what we call functional training, is the result of all that process.
Gotcha. May I ask you one thing about the core and everything? Like lately, there is like this big I don't want to say argue, but like this big point about the fact that the core training must translate to sport performance. So what actually happens to the core is that you must stabilize the spine and to anti-rotate and anti-extend the spine, right? But that happened and so quickly at a so much fast, like high time. I don't know how to say, sorry for my English, but like so quickly they can't be trained with, let's say, a plank or some sort of endurance exercise. What's your opinion on it?
I mean, I would probably say I agree. And I don't know. I think with everything, we're never going to have the perfect way to do something. But what I will tell you is that a plank is much better than a sit-up. So when I look at where core training was when I started, and core training 20 years ago was completely wrong. We did everything wrong. We were probably making everybody's back worse. We were doing Russian twists and scorpions and, sit-ups with people holding your feet. And we just did all kinds of stuff because we thought, again, as the thought process evolved, at that time, somebody said, if you're strong in the front, your back will be better. So get your abs really strong. And then again, when we start looking at functional anatomy and saying, okay, what do those abdominal muscles do? And as you said, you start to realize that they're anti-rotators, they're anti-lateral flexors, they're anti-extension muscles. They're functioning in a very kind of anti-gravity way. But, when you think, oh, that's not going to transfer over to the sports skill, it probably will transfer, because why does slow weight training, why do we think that squatting transfers over to the sports skill? Even though squatting is also occurring very, very slowly. The difference is you strengthen muscles, then you go somewhere and practice your sports skills. And I think you hope that it transfers. What we're seeing is it seems to. There's, when we look at the ability to constrain, because what we're really trying to do from a core training standpoint, we realize now, is we're trying to constrain and restrain the spine. We're trying to keep the spine from going places where it really shouldn't go, whether that's a spondylolisthesis or some sort of rotational fault or whatever it is, as we train these muscles. And we're also trying to train a transfer mechanism so that we can transfer power from the ground through this stable core and then make it come out the top in some cases. So I think, as I said, I think what happens is, again, people would prefer to be contrarian than to learn. So what they want to do is they want to sit around and poke holes and go, no, that's not true. That doesn't happen. And I kind of think, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But what I want you to do is show me what you're doing that's better than what I'm doing. Show me what you're doing that makes more sense based on the current level of the science than what I'm doing. Show me what's safer for my athlete than what I'm doing. Those are the things that I'm looking for. And those, as I said, those are the people that I tend to gravitate towards. I gravitated to Gray Cook very early on, as he talked about the idea of functional movement screen. And even like Gray, when you think, like, imagine that 20 years ago, no one thought about lifting in diagonal patterns. No one thought about chop patterns or lift patterns or any of those things. Gray Cook really went and said, wait, let's look at these kind of D2 patterns from physical therapy, these PNF patterns, Knott and Voss stuff that we can incorporate into strength training, and that maybe we should get somebody to be able to stabilize in these rotational patterns, as opposed to simply, stick 2 feet on the ground and try to move as much weight as you can. So these were all the evolutions. Then McGill came along and said, yeah, now wait a second, let's build on that and let's talk about, okay, what do these core muscles actually do? And how are we supposed to train them? And talk about the idea that maybe flexion, our flexion bias that was so strong at that time, maybe that's not the best thing for somebody, and maybe flexion and repeat flexion is actually dangerous. So these are all the things that went on over time, and they'll continue to happen over time. People will continue to move forward with all of these thought processes, but strength and conditioning coaches are just like, nope, I'm just going to stay here with 2 feet on the ground and keep doing my squats, because that's the best. It's the king of all lifts. If you don't squat, you're not a real man and you're never going to get anywhere. And, you realize that you get people. I have this. So you can see this. I got to try to get things. Think Again. It's called Think Again by Adam Grant. And I love the book. It has nothing to do with strength and conditioning. But all he talks about is the idea that we need to think again. So I think there's 2 really critical books in the last, let's say, 10 years. Simon Sinek's Start With Why and this Think Again. Because when we start talking about training, you have to do 2 things. Start with why. Why are you doing what you're doing? And if you can't clearly, like if your why, and this is particularly like bilateral training, if I say to you, why are you doing it? And if you say stuff like, everybody's always done it for a really long time, then I'm like, that's not a really good why. I want a why. I want a good, solid scientific why. Why are you so emotionally attached to this particular form of training? And then I want you to do what Adam Grant said, which is think again. I want you to think about that again and say, is my why really solid? And that's why, so for me, I get accused all the time. People say, oh, he flip-flops. He's all over the place. Like you said, rear foot elevated split squat. 2 years ago, we were killing rear foot elevated split squat. This year, we went particularly to one leg squat because we said we need to be more purely unilateral. We need to get somebody on one leg and not worry about what's happening with the back leg. Because in this, again, Natera did some research. Back leg's probably handling 35% of the load that you're working with. And there's some research, McGill's talking about potentially the back leg may be causing some pelvic abnormality because you're pulling down on the bench or the stand or whatever you're using. And I started thinking, okay, we're going to move away from a lift that has become, people would look at us and say, well, that's your lift. That's your bread and butter. You're the rear foot elevated split squat guy. And I'm like, no, I used to be the rear foot elevated split squat guy. Now I'm the one leg squat guy, or now I'm the skater squat guy. I'm always evolving because the guy I want to be I want to be the best guy. I want to be the guy everybody's following, chasing. I don't want to be chasing other people. So to do that, to be that guy, you have to chase the really smart people. You've got to figure out, okay, who's the best in the world in any particular area, and then how do I get to them? How do I get their information?
Gotcha. I'll write down the title of the book. So you said think again. I don't remember the author.
Adam Grant. And start with why is Simon Sinek, which is Sinek.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
No problem.
My last question is changing the topic because I would like to go over a bit more topic as possible in this 1 hour that we have. I saw your presentation, the presentation you did for this track and football consumption for like Tony Oller and the other guys. So, and I would like to talk with you about speed and how you change your mind in regards of speed development, and how did you train back in the days and how you training now?
So what we did back, even back 2 or 3 years ago, is we did speed exercises. So there were a lot of, I would call them Vern Gambetta exercises. If you've ever studied Vern stuff, different variations of starts, lean fall runs, ball drop starts, chase sprints, things like that. But we never timed anybody. The only time that we used a timer was when we were training guys for the NFL Combine, because they were going to go to the NFL Combine and they were going to get tested in the 40-yard dash, and we had to make sure they were prepared for that, and we had to work on their start. We had all these things that we had to get better. But we didn't apply that broadly across the board to all of our athletes because I felt like we run sprints. 2 or 3 days out of the week, we run sprints. But what I started to realize when I started looking at Tony Hall's research and Ken Clark and a lot of these guys was, again, when you become empirical, Tony talks about the idea of record, rank, publish, right? Record the times, rank the times, publish the times. When you start to become empirical and record the times, now you're really doing speed work. Because what I found is that our athletes, they ran as fast as they wanted to run, not as fast as they could run. But suddenly when I was recording and ranking, some people who didn't run very fast thought, oh, I don't like being 10th on the list. I want to be first on the list. I'm going to run harder. And all of a sudden, when we started timing, the changes were really drastic, just in terms of the effort that people were putting into sprints, because suddenly we had inserted a little bit of competition, which, again, if you think about athletes, what do athletes thrive on, right? They thrive on competition. But I was taking that away, and I was taking it away for 2 really dumb reasons, and you saw the presentation, so you know them. One, I was worried about guys getting hurt. Okay, if they're running races, running full speed sprints, they're going to pull a hamstring. And I was lazy because getting the timers out and setting up the timers and going through all of that bullshit was time consuming. But then I started to realize, then you start, again, like track, right? I'm thinking, what did I do? I sought out great track people. I sought out a guy like Tony Holler. And Tony starts talking about the fact, wait a second, this is the highest, because people like, again, the bilateral people are into velocity-based training now. Oh, we're going to squat faster. That's the key. We're going to do it faster. And I'm like, fast is like 2 meters a second. That's a fast squat. A slow sprint is 8 meters a second. So I started looking and thinking, wait a second, sprinting is 400 times more powerful as a training tool than squatting. If we're looking at velocity, because I'm going to produce velocities with my glutes, with my hamstrings of 400 times, or 400%, sorry, 4 times more than the comparable weight room activity. And then I started, and this is where I had this conversation last week on a podcast. Have you ever Googled Usain Bolt strength training? I would invite you to go to Google and type in Usain Bolt strength training. Usain Bolt's YouTube clips of strength training look like me at the YMCA in 1970. It is absolutely ridiculous. Leg press, leg extension. There's one of them he's doing, I think, leg press and incline bench at the same time. His strength training is really, really bad. Now, you would look at that and think, oh, his strength training is so bad. If we give him to the bilateral squat people, they say, oh, man, I get him squatting. That guy might be the fastest man in the world. And you look back and say, except he already is the fastest man in the world. And he's not doing any of the things that you say he's supposed to be doing. But then you think again, right? That's what I mean with this Adam Grant book. You think again and you say, well, what is he doing? Oh, he's running fast, and he's running fast a lot. That must be the stimulus. And I always go back. You're probably a little too young to remember, but I go back to the Charlie Francis stuff, Ben Johnson, Carl Lewis. And you look at Ben Johnson and Carl Lewis was more like a Usain Bolt type, not a weight room guy, lankier build. You'd see pictures of him, and he would be like Bolt. He'd be doing leg extensions and doing leg presses. You see Ben Johnson, and they're talking about Ben can squat 600 pounds. Ben can bench 365. Ben is a weight room guy. You look at their splits for the 100-meter race, they're almost identical. So you've got one guy, confirmation bias, Lewis, doing everything that the strength coach wants him to do, and the strength coach says, see, that's how you get strong. Then you got the other guy on the other side and say, wait a second. And then, then you know what they say? Oh, he's an outlier. He's just different. If we could get Lewis to do what Johnson did, Lewis would be much faster than Johnson. And I would look at it and say, probably not. Much like the same way with Bolt. So I think, as I said, I think in the conventional bilateral sort of powerlifting oriented world, there is just a massive amount of confirmation bias. All they want to do is be right. And they won't spend a lot of time looking at the alternate route. Most of the bilateral people I know have never aggressively tried unilateral training. Yet they're totally against it. And it's like saying, food. I dislike that food. Can't eat it. Well, have you ever tried it? No, I've never tried it. But I don't like the way it looks. That's sort of the unilateral, bilateral debate from the bilateral side. And I look at some of those people and think, I would just like you to try bilateral training. But most of the people say, oh, I tried it, with my power lifters and their squat didn't go up. And I'm like, well, that's not trying it. That's not what we're talking about. I want you to try it with an athlete and tell me if you think the athletic process was better, worse, or same based on that change. And I know it's going to be better because I've been there. I was that guy. I mean, I could take you back to the 1990s at BU, and everybody was back squatting at Boston University. Every athlete. And now I look at it and think, 2021, no one is back squatting. The only people who back squat in our gym are people who have to go to another team where they test in the back squat. That's the only time we let somebody back squat is when they have a back squat test because we want them to be prepared for their test. So that would be, like you said, what's the exception? The exception is somebody who's going to a school or a team where bilateral strength is prioritized, and then we would let that person do that.
I get you. The presentation you did was really, really cool because it's not, may I say one thing, it's not easy to find people that come on their steps, especially in this industry. it's like nobody wants to say that they were wrong. So I felt like that presentation was really good, and they got like precise indication of why to do it, and how even you is it how you even you set up your gym to perform the speed part at the beginning
Yeah,
of
we completely changed our layout
yeah,
to be able to do that.
that's a
And,
precise.
but that's what I mean, and that's why I look at it and think that's why we're ahead. Because I have people who say, "Oh, I'm looking at, we're trained. We've got a 20,000 square foot gym. We've got hundreds of clients. We're having huge amounts of success. Yet people are like, oh, he's wrong." I'm kind of like, if I was wrong, why is the gym just, why are we getting bigger and bigger? And why are there people like, you talked about, why are there people in 30 countries teaching our certification? Why is my book in 12 languages? And it is because it makes sense. It resonates with intelligent people. The people it doesn't resonate with are the bilateral people, because they are people who, I always said, I'm a threat to that whole world, that whole existence, because they look at me and think, I don't want people to listen to Mike Boyle. Because if they listen to Mike Boyle, I become less significant in their eyes. Whether, what I'm good at becomes less of a priority for these people. And so they dig in and they become really defensive. And I look at it and think, don't become defensive. Become smarter. Look at it and say, well, why is this happening? As opposed to thinking, I don't want it to happen. Because it's going to happen anyway. At least I think so.
So moving on for the last question is
Okay.
precisely in regards of this topic. So how to create one of the most successful S&C coaches development system. And as you said just briefly, you develop a business that is in more than 30 countries. So you got like, you can get your certification basically anywhere in the world at this point. So how did you do that?
I think we did it by being true to our principles. We did it because we didn't set out to make money. That was the most important thing. So we were building a business, but the goal of the business wasn't to make money. And most business people would be like, what is the point of a business if you're not trying to make money? We set out a business, or to develop a business that was going to educate people and going to give them what we thought was the best education in fitness or personal training or strength and conditioning. And then we were going to let that business grow really organically. We were going to partner with really good people. So anytime anybody came to us and had sort of a money orientation, a financial orientation, we looked at them and said, no, we're probably not. We're not a good match. We're not about, yeah, we want to make money. But I always say to people, I look at everything and think 5 years down the road, what's this going to be like? Not tomorrow, not a year from now, but 5 years down the road, what's it going to be like? And that's allowed us to develop really good business. And then what I did, I got really good people. I partnered with the brightest young guys that I had in my business and said, you guys are going to be the teachers. You guys are going to get out and you're going to travel, because I'm looking at it thinking, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be in 30 countries. I don't want to be all over the world. I need really good, smart young guys. And then we made it really systematic. And so we started to review the teaching of the course to make sure that we were consistent and that we weren't in situations where if you went to Kevin Carr's course, it was different than Brendan Rearick's course, or if Marco taught your course, it was different. The course has to be the course all the time. The other thing that we did that nobody else was doing is we made the course practical. We said at the end of the course, you're going to have to demonstrate that you can do what we taught you, which is really intimidating for a lot of people, because it's amazing how many people there are in fitness or strength and conditioning who aren't good movers. They may be good weightlifters, but when you say, okay, demonstrate this speed drill or this warm up or this stretch or this ladder drill, they move like Frankenstein. And you think, okay, if you can't move, you can't really teach in this field. But there's a lot of people, again, in the bilateral world that clunk around and you look at them and think, okay, this guy, if you want to learn to squat, he's your guy. He's going to teach you how to squat. If you want to learn to do anything else, you're going to have to find somebody else, because that guy can't do anything besides squat. The other thing we did is we made you have a knowledge base prior to coming in. So if you take the Certified Functional Strength Coach course, you have to get an 80 or above on the test prior to going to the course. So we give you a test before you come, because what I want to eliminate, I always said, I want to eliminate what I called the seminar killer. And the seminar killer was someone who wanted to take the seminar, but didn't want to do the work. So they showed up totally unprepared, and then they asked questions every 2 minutes. What about this? And you used to look at that person and think, what are you doing here? You know, have you read my book? Have you watched any of the videos? Do you have any understanding of what we're doing? We've eliminated that, because somebody needs to, you'd sign up for Certified Functional Strength Coach, and then you get, it might be 20 hours of stuff to watch. And you get like PDF copies of the books, and then you go and take the pretest that allows you to come to the live course. So we did a lot of things that were different from everybody else. Everybody else was like, just get somebody's money, sit them on their ass for 8 hours or 16 hours over the weekend, and then have them do a test at the end and tell them they're certified. We went the total opposite way. We said, nope, I want you to study for as many hours as you need to study to understand our system. Then I want you to take a test that shows me that you did that. Then you're going to come to the class, and you're not going to sit on your ass at all. You're going to be 100% practical. You're going to be moving the whole time. You're going to do everything that we're teaching you. You're going to learn by doing. Then at the end, we're going to ask you to show it to us and say, okay, show us this drill. Show us this drill. What's the progression? What's the regression? Show us that you understand the system. So we developed a system of education that was completely unlike anybody else's. And as a result, it's been, way more successful than I ever would have suspected. If someone had said what you said, which is this is going to be in 30 countries, we're going to have partners. We have partners in China. We're working on new partners in Hong Kong. We have partners in Korea. We have partners in Japan. We have partners in Hungary. We have partners in Dubai. We have partners in Italy. We're developing a partnership, for France and Belgium. We have partners in England. Literally everywhere in the world, we've got people that want to teach this system. And they want to teach this system because it's good, not because they're making a lot of money. We don't make it very lucrative for those people. They make money, but they don't make a killing. But they have to be like us. They have to be committed to educating trainers and coaches. They have to really want to make a difference. And if they do, then they can kind of be part of that CFSC family and be able to host these courses and teach these courses.